Hello, my name is Lainey Feingold, and my session for Accessible Canada, Accessible World is Delay Plagues U.S. Accessibility Regulations. Can Canada do better? So this is one of two sessions that I'm offering to the gathering. The other one is about collaboration skills. So as we do the work going forward, we have the tools and the strategies to build sustainable relationships to advance accessibility. This talk is about the delay that, as the title says, I believe has plagued U.S. accessibility regulations for many years, despite strong commitments from government agencies, despite good people being in the agencies. I have been involved in the digital accessibility space since 1995. I've done work in collaboration using the process called structured negotiation, primarily with the blind community over these past 25 plus years. And I've seen the delay firsthand. I've seen the problems it causes when there aren't regulations. I've also seen effective advocacy without regulations because often we don't have them. So that's what I want to talk about today. And can Canada do better? That's the ending question. So on the title slide, I have the title of the talk, Delay Plagues U.S. Accessibility Regulations. Can Canada do better? The streams, this is probably relevant to many streams. I picked innovation and standards and policy because this is about my experience with accessibility standards in the US. And then I have the date of the conference, May 27, 28. My website is lflegal.com. I do a lot of writing about digital accessibility law, digital accessibility best practices, collaboration skills. I have a global accessibility law and policy page with, of course, a section on Canada national, as well as a section on Canada provinces, Canadian provinces. So I invite you to take a look at that now and going forward. And I always invite feedback, corrections to anything I write on my website. Everything is Creative Commons. So if you find anything there that will be helpful in your activities around improving digital accessibility, I invite you to use it under the Creative Commons license. So first off, lingo. Have a picture here of some alphabet soup because to understand the regulation process in the US and all the delays that have occurred, there's some basic terms that have to be recognized. So the first, ANPRM. You see why I have a vegetable alphabet soup picture here. There's a lot of acronyms. They aren't accessible. Whenever we use acronyms around regulations, I encourage all of us to use the full words, all the words first, then the acronym. I myself am constantly looking up abbreviations and acronyms for meanings on accessibility websites. So ANPRM is the Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Federal agencies, and in this talk, we're going to be talking about federal United States regulations, not regulations within individual states, because there are those too. Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and an agency doesn't have to start with that, but can, when they're thinking about doing regulations, when they want to sort of put out feelers to what the public thinks, when they want to ask questions. So that's ANPRM. The next one is NPRM, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This is required. You can't have a federal rule unless you have the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, although there may be some emergency exceptions that don't typically, I'm not aware of them ever applying to accessibility. So the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is where the federal agency puts out what they think should be the rule. The public always has an opportunity to respond, typically 90 days, sometimes longer. And then the agency goes back, looks at all the comments, and issues the final rule. Unfortunately, there is no time frame required between the NPRM and the final rule. And there's no time frame required between the ANPRM, the advance notice, and the NPRM, the notice. As far as I know, the only requirement on time is the comment period, how much time the public has to give their feedback. The Department of Justice, which we refer to as the DOJ, is the agency responsible for the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA enforcement. They do a lot of the regulations, not all of them. Another agency that does a lot of accessibility regulations is the United States Access Board. They're an agency in charge of federal buildings and other aspects of the federal government. There are other agencies too that issue accessibility regulations. Department of Transportation, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission does employment. Department of Education can do ones around education. But for them to be adopted into the Americans with Disabilities Act, regulations have to go through the Department of Justice. Then the last two I want to reference because they're really important and hardly anyone has ever heard of them. Speaking of myself, until I got deeply involved in accessibility regulations, I had never heard of them. We have the Office of Management and Budget, which is kind of looking at federal expenses from the money side of things. Within that, we have the OIRA, which stands for Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. That is the place, the OIRA within the OMB is the place where regulations often get stuck. Because after the DOJ does the ANPRM, the NPRM, the final rule, looks at the comments, has to get the okay from this OIRA within the OMB. People of a certain age are probably singing a song from Hair right now. I am in my head. So yeah, this is some of the language that comes into play. And I think the complexity of the language actually probably contributes to some of the delay that I've been concerned with over the years. Enough with the lingo. What are some examples of the United States delays in accessibility regulations? First one I want to share is about pedestrian accessibility, which is safety. This is a picture of an accessible pedestrian signal. It has audio output. It has vibrotactile output. Without an accessible pedestrian signal, blind pedestrians and others have no information about when it is safe to cross a street. We need regulations on this. What is the issue? The accessible pedestrian signals, also curb ramps, sidewalks. You know, will they be smooth enough for a wheelchair? Or the curb ramps have detectable warnings for blind people? Are they the right steepness, width, etc., for people who use mobility devices? What has been the timing on this? It all started in 1999 with an advisory committee. In 2013, there were draft guidelines. In 2023, there was finally a final rule by the Access Board, which meant there had been I think there was an ANPRM plus an NPRM. We still need a proposed and final rule by the Department of Justice to incorporate that into rules under the ADA. But the good news and the important news in the United States is that the Americans with Disabilities Act is very strong. It requires effective communication. It requires that state and local governments not discriminate. So we were able, in our collaboration with the city of San Francisco, to reach an agreement over 10 years ago that these types of signals would be installed across San Francisco, and that a program would be developed where people can request signals in other places, all without the regulations. So it's really important to understand that although I'm talking about regulation delay, it doesn't mean activism delay. It doesn't mean enforcement delay. It doesn't mean that the ADA is on a shelf until there are regulations. So we got these accessible pedestrian signals. There's other lawsuits pending. I think now still pending or recently resolved with New York, Chicago, even though we don't have the final regulations for pedestrian safety. So that's one example. Also want to share about the kiosks, which are sometimes called self-service transaction machines. This is a picture of a tabletop kiosk in a restaurant, it's basically an iPad or a device like an iPad where you can pay securely for your meals, you can order. Again, it's not just about accessibility in some sort of vacuum, it's about security of credit card information. If people can't use systems designed to be used independently, security is broken. Privacy is not available. So kiosks are very important. I chose this picture of a restaurant kiosk, but kiosks are now used everywhere in healthcare. There's 2 lawsuits pending in the United States right now, where the blind community has won the first round, actually for several rounds, they're still on appeal, about healthcare kiosks, where again, we're talking the privacy of information that's supposed to be delivered independently through the technology. If it's not accessible, it's not private and secure. What's happening with regulations on that? Well, in 2010, the Department of Justice and the Access Board both issued, or jointly, I'm not quite sure, issued advance notice, the ANPRM, of proposed rulemaking for kiosks. In 2022, again, the Access Board issued another ANPRM. The reason for this is that between 2010, 2022, we had a Republican administration that in 2017 said no more regulations. So anything that was pending 2010, it started under the Obama administration. 2017, everything was yanked. 2022, again, we have a Democratic administration. So again, we have the ANPRM. We still need the final rule by the Access Board, and we still need rulemaking by the DOJ. Again, the good news is that advocates, lawyers, civil rights lawyers aren't waiting for these regulations. I have an article on my website, which is lflegal.com. I made a short link, bit.ly/accessible-kiosk. There I keep track. It's called, I think it's called Kiosks, the law is paying attention. And I put in that article all the legal developments around kiosks. There was a structured negotiation that lawyers in the blind community did around these restaurant kiosks. Like I said, there's lawsuits on the healthcare kiosks. So we're not waiting in the United States for regulations, but it would be so much easier and better to take the arguments out of the details around kiosks. You know, without regulations, it's too easy for people to say, well, there's another way to do it. We don't need accessibility. We don't need audio output. So we need regulations and we're not waiting for them. So the last one I want to share is what's happening in the web accessibility regulations in the US. This is about accessibility of websites and mobile applications, the technical standards. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, already says no discrimination against disabled people. Already says if you're covered by the ADA, you have to effectively communicate. Well, there's no way to effectively communicate digital content if it's not accessible. What we don't have are regulations spelling out what accessibility means. We don't have regulations putting the web content accessibility guidelines into the ADA, although courts recognize that complying with the web content accessibility guidelines is a way to comply with the ADA. And the Justice Department recognizes that too. So what is the status? In 2010, there was a DOJ ANPRM, advance notice of proposed rulemaking for web access in both the public and private sector. In 2017, again, freeze on all pending regulations. 2022, intent to issue regulations. 2023, the DOJ put out a notice of proposed rulemaking just for the public sector, state and local government, not private sector. And yesterday, I'm recording this on April 9, yesterday on April 8th, the Department of Justice announced the final rule has been signed. It will be published as an official document any day now. And there's a press release and you can read the unofficial version. So that's April 24, from 2010 to April 24 to get the final rule for state and local government. And we still need rulemaking for the private sector. That's too long. My article about all this, the delay, the history, the fact that the DOJ is still enforcing the ADA around web and mobile, even without regulations, is in this short link I have here, bit.ly/accessible-web. So you can read more about that. I have similar stories. If we have more time, I could tell you the gory details about delays in accessible medical diagnostic equipment. I mean, talk about health and safety and privacy. It took from 2010 to 2017. It's partially done. It's not all the way done. Movie theater captioning and audio description, which I worked on in structured negotiation, there were lawsuits. The ADA was strong enough to get it done. But had we had regulations, it would have been done faster, hopefully without legal even being involved at all. That took from 2010 to 2016. The Section 508 refresh. Section 508 is a law that applies to federal government purchases and the rights of federal employees who are disabled to have accessibility at work. That took, it's called a refresh, took from 2006 to 2017. During that time, they issued 2 advance notices of proposed rulemaking, 1 NPRM before the final. Section 504, which is about federal spending in the US. If you're going to spend money, you can't discriminate. Those haven't had an update in regulations for 50 years. Very important in the education space, really needed, was promised in 2022 or 2021. The Department of Education said they want to do it. No word yet. So this is why I have the picture of the woman waiting in the rain on a trunk, pouring rain with an umbrella overhead, looking down the train tracks, waiting for the train to come, waiting, but we can't wait to do our advocacy despite the delay that we have in regulations. So can Canada do better? How can Canada do better? I have a couple ideas for avoiding the type of regulation delay we have here in the US with the image of the Canadian provinces. Of course, I'm from the United States. You know Canada better. But some ideas based on my experience, deadlines need to be imposed at all stages. I didn't write this down, but probably should have penalties for not meeting time requirements. Can we streamline agents? Can you in Canada streamline agency review? So there's not one agency that has to be approved by another agency that has to go up to a higher agency within the president's office, which is basically what the Office of Management and Budget, the OIRA, which I've already forgotten, the regulatory department within the Office of Management and Budget. Can agency review be streamlined? Can we aim for evergreen language, especially for tech? And by evergreen, I mean the Department of Justice and the regulations for public sector websites that they just put out yesterday is based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is already at 2.2. Is there any way to make things evergreen so they don't have to be updated? Can we put the kind of strong language like effective communication, non-discrimination into regulations? So even if the technology changes, we still have that strong language. Can we avoid politics? As I said, when we had a Republican administration, in 2017, they pulled every pending regulation. So can we avoid politics? As you know, the United States has an election this November. So, whether accessibility goes forward or comes to a complete halt depends on President Biden getting reelected. So let's do what we can to make that happen. And most importantly, my question is your idea here. So I hope at the Accessible Canada, Accessible World gathering, we can all think about what would it take to avoid the kind of delays we've seen in the US, despite committed people within the agencies who want to do the right thing. So your idea here, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to hearing it. I set a timer so I would keep this to the time frame. And I think I did it. I want to put the closing slide up, which says stay in touch with my name. Again, I'm Lainey Feingold. I have a picture of my book here. It's called Structured Negotiation, a Winning Alternative to Lawsuits. And it tells the stories of how we did this advocacy work without regulations in many cases. Started with talking ATMs in the mid 1990s, which, if you don't know, Canada had the very first ones because of advocacy with the blind community. We did all the talking ATM work long before there were any talking ATM regulations. So there's a lot of regulatory overlap in the stories of blind people and advocacy that I share in my book. My website is lflegal.com. If you want to keep up to date, I try to write things for my website whenever anything big happens, but I always put things on LinkedIn first. So you can find me there if you want to stay updated with these kinds of things. And again, I do have a global digital accessibility policy page with laws and policies and implementation ideas from around the country, around the world. I invite contributions to that. Thank you very much, and onward to a more efficient regulatory process. Thank you.